My name is Sean Blackwell, and this is an introduction to my new book, Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. And I'm just going through the contents of what people are going to find in that book and what I think is interesting about it. And right from the beginning, the recap that I would talk about is a summary of my first book, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? And the book will follow a kind of a timeline, 1996 to 2007 was that first book. And as I'm going, I'm introducing different concepts like transpersonal psychology, spiritual emergency from Stan Groff. But I'm telling the story along the way in terms of what happened to me, the adventures I had, that kind of thing. When we get into this book, we cover part one, the development of the Bipolar Awakenings Healing Retreat. A lot of you guys know that I do this private retreat for people, and I've been at that since 2013. But when you look at when it started, it's like I was trying to figure out how to work with people from 2007. Okay. So when you look at chapter one, Genesis, the beginning, the very beginning, I talk about my first years on YouTube, becoming a YouTube sleuth or a YouTube detective. These days, when we talk about research and scientific research, we talk about things being very objective and scientific, and you've got your data all lined up and that kind of thing. But my background was in advertising where we just did the best we could. And just because you have something that's quantifiably accurate doesn't make it for a good idea for an advertising, it doesn't make it for good advertising. So when I was trying to understand this relationship between what I've been through, like spiritual emergency, and bipolar disorder, I was going about it more like a detective or a sleuth. And the first place I was talking to people was on YouTube, right? And that's why I started to learn that many people with bipolar disorder were being diagnosed, or many people with spiritual experiences were being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So I was trying to figure out what's the difference between spiritual emergency that I had and this thing called bipolar disorder that I really knew nothing about. And that's where the book starts. Almost right away, we started to have people coming to us that we were working with, and I thought, well, I'm going to talk about a lot of people. So I want to make them memorable. So I gave everybody a nickname. And probably the most notorious client I ever had was a guy, and I've changed all the names of the regular clients, but I call him Chipmunk Chick. And the reason was that this was a guy on YouTube who had a YouTube following, and he was gay, and he would dress as a blonde woman and do comedy on YouTube. And once he was dressed up, he just had this gorgeous face and he was hilarious. And then after meeting him, it turned out he had a bipolar diagnosis. And then within a few days of meeting him, he was like, "Can I stay with you for a while? My birthday's coming up." And I was like, "Well, how long are you thinking?" And he's like, "A week." And I'm like, "Oh my God, this guy I just met on YouTube wants to stay with me for a week." I brought it up with my wife and she said, "Okay, bring him to the house." And he flew down to Sao Paulo from Brasilia. And we did a little bit of work with this guy and just hung out with him. And that was sort of our first stop, was with Gabrielle. And because he was making funny videos, we also made funny videos with him. Like, because he brought 6 wigs with him, 6 wigs for different women. And one day we spent the day where he put a green screen up on my wall and he dressed as a female psychiatrist and I was his client. And then we videotaped me being his client while he was my psychiatrist. It was really, really crazy. And so then the next was a guy that we called the Jock, Paul, because he was like 6'4", 220 pounds. He was built like a linebacker. He just worked out 2 hours a day. And he was a friend of a friend's, and he became the next guy. And then, so as I'm talking about these client stories through this first chapter, I'm also bringing up the theoretical concepts. Like, for example, with Gabrielle, we actually took him to a holotropic breathwork workshop down here in Sao Paulo, and I was breathing as well. I wasn't a facilitator, I was just breathing. And so I have to explain holotropic breathwork, and then I talk about his weekend. And we even did some breathing with Paul too. So you can see that this idea of using the over breathing of holotropic breathwork with people with bipolar disorder starts very early. Then I get into what I call the vision. And this is the work of Ken Wilber, because early on, I started to get the idea that the reason people had such difficulty understanding mental disorders as some sort of a spiritual process was that we're just not there in terms of consciousness. And I had studied Ken Wilber for many years. He helped me understand my own development. And so I get into this whole chapter where I really hope I don't lose my audience, but I find it really interesting. And I get into Ken Wilber's work. And one of the things about Ken Wilber's work is he's very wordy and there's a lot of books and it's really complicated. So what I decided to do was just create some simple charts where I'm explaining how I understand his work and how I apply it, right? So let me just pop up here. So like the first one is like Ken Wilber works with what we would call 4 quadrants, what he calls the I, the it, the we, and the its. So the it would be like your exterior of the individual. And you can see those words up there. The exterior of the individual, that would be like your biology. The interior of the individual is like your psychology. On a collective level, it's society that we can measure with economy and archaeology sometimes. And then the intersubjective or the we is the cultural and even the spiritual. So you get these 4 different quadrants going, and I take it one piece at a time and I explain quadrant by quadrant until I get to this incredibly wild model, which sort of lays out what I think is a very comprehensive idea of what the evolution of consciousness looks like. And when you look at that and how, as I explain it, you start to understand why it's only now that we're starting to understand mental disorders as coming from an spiritual interior, not connected to religion. Okay, it's something that you're going through as an inner process, working through your inner spirit. And so obviously a very big detailed map. And my friend Sylvie in Montreal is the one who put this together for me. So shout out to Sylvie. It took us a long time to get there, but it was a lot of fun. And it's also the reason why my book is so damn big. Maybe Calvin, could you just come on the camera for a second and show people the book again,
Oh.
just compared to your head? You can see it's a thick book, but it's 7 by 10. It's a very big book. And that's why it's a little pricier than you would expect. And the reason is I wanted to get that detailed chart onto one page where that tiny text would fit. I go pretty deep on Ken Wilber's work, and I go deep into problems that Stan Grof had with his work and this whole inner dynamic that was going on in transpersonal psychology. They weren't getting along with each other. It was kind of a food fight in there for a minute. And I explain all that stuff because Ken Wilber wasn't really understanding the spiritual dimension of non-ordinary states in an accurate way. But Grof criticized him for that. And I talk all about that sort of inner thing. And I also talk about why a lot of people don't like Ken Wilber's work, why everybody hates Ken. His work makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And I just think he's coming from a different place that people don't really understand particularly well. Okay. So 40 or 50 pages on that. It's the kind of thing where it's like, if it's not for you, go ahead and skip it or skim through it. If you just want to read the client stories, great. That's fine. And we come back into that working with more people on a volunteer basis, and the years are going by, so we're getting into 2009, 2010, this kind of thing. And you'll see the years in the book. And then I talk about, for example, my start with Grof transpersonal training, where I learned how to be a holotropic breathwork facilitator. And then we get to this chapter 4, Kundalini. And this is an important chapter because I get into detail about a Kundalini awakening process that I had on a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat. And it becomes very clear to me that, whoa, what I'm going through here was very similar to what I went through in the hospital or what put me in the hospital. It's just I had a little more experience for what was going on. So it's a really important chapter, especially because Kundalini becomes a subject that keeps coming back later in the book. It comes back with the clients who've been diagnosed with bipolar, right? And so then around 2010, I talk about a video that actually brought Calvin and I together because he saw my video on bipolar disorder or a spiritual awakening. And he loved that video and he got in touch with me. And that's kind of where we started our friendship. And I get back into the theory a little bit. It's like I've worked with a few people, I've had a lot of experience talking with people online. And so then we get into that. And I'll show you a few of the things from there. So, along with this sort of evolution of consciousness, now I also start talking about the relationship between, well, what's spiritual emergency, what's schizophrenia, what's bipolar disorder, and how do these things relate to each other? One of the things I talk about is that there's no clear dividing line. And the reason is that from the transpersonal side, the transpersonal psychologists, they would look at spiritual emergency and say, well, that's completely different than mental illness. They knew you could work through these spiritual processes. They knew that. But on the mad pride anti-psychiatry side, the mad pride people were like, hey, people like Lauren Mosher and John Weir Perry at Soteria, they were working with people in a first break of psychosis from the very beginning, and they didn't care whether it was spiritual or paranoid or what. They didn't care about the profile. It was first break. They worked with them. So the mad pride people saw the transpersonal people as kind of elitist, and the transpersonal people looked at the mad pride people and thought, well, they just don't get it, you know. So how do we resolve that schism? You know, in my chapter, in chapter 5, I talk about, well, the problem is that they're both partially right, both partially wrong, because what we're looking at is a spectrum of non-ordinary experiences that happen in acute psychosis. And then when the spectrum is more blissful, positive, connectedness, and all that kind of thing, it starts to look like a spiritual emergency, and it's easier to process. And it's easier to process with no meds and with very little support. When it's more disturbing and it looks more paranoid and there's more hallucinations going on, and you get like the devil after you and the CIA's following you and these kind of things, it's a much more disturbing process. It tends to get labeled schizophrenia. And in those cases, especially with limited resources, medications are probably going to be what's needed. You know, most people with this bipolar label are sort of finding themselves in the middle. Most people tend to have the spiritual side and the psychotic, and Groff recognized that. So I spend a lot of time on this spectrum. That's really what chapter 5 is all about, and how to almost predict what type of psychosis a person could have based on their background. And vice versa. You can predict a person's background by learning about the nature of their psychosis. All right. And it has a lot to do with trauma, and it has a lot to do with evolution of consciousness. When you're working with holotropic breathwork, for example, you're helping people work through trauma. That's what you're doing. This was a hard journey. I thought I was, well, this is kind of embarrassing to say, but I can tell you. You know, some people would write me in 2008 and say, you know, you're going to be on Oprah Winfrey, this kind of thing. Now, I didn't think I was going to be on Oprah Winfrey, but I thought things were just going to come out of the box like boom. And this thing was just going to take over by about 2010, 2011. And I was really preparing for that sort of Mayan calendar thing, 2012. I don't write about that in the book, but I thought everything was going to be going off in 2012, and I was dead wrong. It was a terrible year for me. It was tough. What I found was I was really stuck, but I had some research to do. I wanted to open a clinic or something, get started to work with people in a more structured format. And so I started to visit different places. And so I started to visit what I would call the Spiritist hospitals here in Brazil. Went to one of those. That's a place where they have mediums, people who channel spirits in Brazil, work with people who have mental disorders. But each hospital is a little bit different, you know, and what happens is the psychiatrists do their job, but then if people want spiritism, they go to the spiritist too. And in the end, you have no idea what worked because you're doing both at the same time. But anyway, so they had those hospitals. We wanted to see how like this sort of religious form of spirituality could fit into the hospitals, and if maybe we could fit into a hospital like that, you know, because spiritism is a Christian faith. You need to believe in Jesus. You need to study the Bible to be a spiritist, and then you channel these Christian spirits. But I also paid a trip to Vermont where there's a lot of alternative work going on. And we also tried to sort of bond with people in psychiatry here in Sao Paulo. And we visited, Ligia and I, we visited this organization called ProSer, which was like the Project for the Study of Religious and Spiritual Experience, except in Portuguese. And we went there, and I just found a lot of what I didn't like. And that's why the whole chapter is called Stuck. It wasn't that I didn't like what was going on at the hospital or in Vermont or at ProSer. I thought it was all helpful, but it wasn't what I had in mind. I really wanted something that was going to be deeply healing to people in a very short period of time. With this chapter 7, Leap, Leap is where I talk about my very first client. I was inspired by a YouTube video, funny enough, where this guy was saying, many people want to start a big business, but when they think about their business, they think about the finished product. And when they do that, they never get started. All you need is one person who's prepared to pay you for what you do. And I thought, I think I know that one person. It's this woman, Livia, in Romania, who's translated all my work into Romania. She was my biggest fan. As soon as I saw that video, I called her up. I said, do you want to work with me? And she said, yeah, right away. And that was it. I had been to Italy when I was 18 years old. And then here I was, late 40s, going to Romania, from Brazil. So this was like a big deal. And it was there that I really modified holotropic breath work into what I call bipolar breath work for the first time. And I explained that difference. It's more personalized, gives more space, that kind of thing. And then I flew, of course, as everybody does, I flew from Romania to Austin, Texas for a SAMHSA conference that was organized by Oryx Cohn, if any of you guys know him. Big conference, 1,000 people there. And that's when I had my first look live at the peer support movement. So I could see how my work fit in with peer support. All right. Also showed Ligia peer support for the first time. It was very inspiring to her. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of backstory to my work before we even got started. 8 was 2014, the expedition. That's where I worked with 4 clients in the same year in Europe. First, I went to a transpersonal conference in Greece, transpersonal psychology, and I presented on my work. Then to work with Livia for a second retreat. Then Monica Kettler in Germany, Kirsten Ogard in Finland, and one other client in France, and then to the first Crazy Wise conference. That's a conference that's going on in Rotterdam for 8 years now. So that was an incredible experience. And to arrive in Rotterdam and get up in front of this conference and have almost half the people in the room familiar with my work, it was a shock. It was like 150 people, 50 or 60 people put their hands up. They knew my work. I was just floored. So that was a very powerful trip for me. And all of those retreats were like home runs. Like Livia, Moni, Kirsten, we just knocked it out of the park. They all had very powerful healing processes, Then the inevitable comes, what I call the inevitable. I'll just say this. Chapter 9 explains my disaster. I had a retreat in India that was an absolute disaster, but I learned a lot from it. We'll put it like that. And again, learning and connecting at different conferences in Brazil and Latvia. Monica Kettler came to the conference in Brazil. Kirsten Ogard joined me in Latvia for a psychiatric nursing conference. And we were introducing psychiatric nurses to what we were doing together. It was amazing. At the end of this whole process here, I start to talk about how my work started to become more and more sophisticated. And I was realizing the need for, as I said, or as I put it on this chart, I recognized that it wasn't just making a compromise. It wasn't just playing politics, but that all 4 of these approaches were really needed to give people a comprehensive healing program. You needed to have psychology, psychiatry, the peer support movement, and shamanism all involved. Shamanism is a little tricky to explain, but I introduced it right there. And then that way you cover the intellectual, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual, and they all have their role. And I think that that's really important. And I think that that makes the work that I'm doing quite different from what you're seeing out there. Because at the peer support is slowly getting integrated into psychiatry, Transpersonal psychology isn't there at all. Shamanism isn't there at all unless you're going to a shaman individually. So, you're just, it's not integrated anywhere else. And that's why I thought it was important to put there. So I go into detail there. And then I talk about the discoveries of that, very powerful first few years working on private retreats, 2013 to 2015. That really lays out what you can do. And there's like a list of 10 different things we can do. The second part is where my work gets super weird because I started to realize on my retreats that I was absorbing a lot of energy from my clients. Eventually, we came to realize that, oh, it's actually better if I'm doing breath work on behalf of my clients, or we have somebody else. For example, Monica Kettler was what we called the surrogate breather, breathing for our clients, along with the client breathing for themselves. And where that came out of was, it was a long process, but this chapter I call Heresy. What I'm just telling you about being a surrogate breather, energy coming to me from a client, was absolutely not accepted in the Groff work. It wasn't. Even my own trainer told me that was my own projections. And I'm like, if all of this is my projections, I must be the craziest person on the planet, because I can't be going through this with every single client, these horrific nightmares and my head feeling like it's a watermelon and all this kind of thing. So I start to talk about what it's like to absorb energy. And then along the way, some of my first energy absorption experiences involved going through other people's birth processes. So on the theoretical side, got to bring up what Groff calls his basic perinatal matrices, the stages of the birth process that can hold a lot of trauma, and to work through those processes can be very healing. So again, I'm sort of inserting theory into the client's stories of working with Urs, right? When I talk about the skateboarder, Tim, that's where we really start to put this surrogate breathwork process into a test to see how we can do this. Tim was the client. Monica Kettler became his surrogate breather, and I was facilitating the whole thing. We were seeing how that went. And Kirsten came back from Finland, and she did the same as well. And she let us know that we were on the right track, and that's why it was a breakthrough to include the surrogate breathwork as well, even though it was going completely against my training. And so then it just becomes more detail of more theory, more conferences, and some freaky stuff. Like I had a parallel universe is about a dream I had in, I believe it was August 2015. And the meaning of that dream surfaced in March of 2016, because I basically saw my dream opening a movie. Like the movie showed the thing I had dreamt about 8 months earlier. So it was like, oh my God, I think I just landed in a parallel universe. And then I close out this second section with what I call the evolution of shamanism. And that's where I talk about the typical New Age shamanism that we're all used to now. If you've ever gone to a shamanic event or the Burning Man, for example, there will be lots of what I would call New Age shamanism there, which comes from a real postmodern perspective. But then I contrast that to tribal shamanism, all right? Because postmodern people tend to think that they're imitating tribal shamanism, but they're not exactly. They're only borrowing the parts of tribal shamanism that they like or that they're comfortable with, and they're leaving the rest. So I go into detail about tribal shamanism, what that's like, what the tribal mind is like compared to the postmodern mind. And then I talk about what I call quantum shamanism. And I think that this sort of surrogate breathwork work is a style of stage 8 quantum shamanism. So along with this sort of surrogate work where we learn that, energy can be transferred to me and I can work through it on behalf of a client, I start to experiment with doing that at a distance. Yeah, start to experiment with doing this sort of healing at a distance, working in what I would call a quantum space, or like a quantum shaman where there's no time and no space, and trying that out. One of the first places that I wanted to get a deeper understanding is a very interesting technique called family constellation therapy. And that involves a therapist they have a client, and then there's a series of volunteers. And then the client selects different volunteers to represent their family members, and they position them in a sacred space. All right. When they're in that sacred space, they start to talk to each other. The volunteers talk to each other, being guided by the therapist, as if they are the person that they're representing. Like somebody's representing the mother, they talk as if she's the mother. Or in my case, I was pulled into a situation and I didn't know who I was. And then I started to feel a lot of love for the person representing the client. And we figured out that I was representing the soul of the client's boyfriend, who had been very helpful to her in navigating her family issues. So I get into this family constellation therapy thing, and then that helps me start to work with people at a distance, all right, in what I call distance surrogate breathwork. I talk about my first experiences with that. Yeah, my first experiences with distance surrogate breathwork, where it's really like me doing breathwork on behalf of people and discovering that, oh, guess what? I'm having the same sort of psychic experiences and nightmares and visions at a distance that I am when I work with people live. Okay. I have a video on the evolution of these different techniques as well that's 30 minutes long. It's called Innovations in Healing Bipolar Disorder. And that's been really my most recent work, is this online distance work, right? There's a technique I developed that people can do on their own called conscious emotional clearing. And in the final chapter there of that part 3, I give detailed instructions on how you can do conscious emotional clearing at home. And that's where you don't go into a non-ordinary state, but you just work on processing the emotions that are coming to your surface. Part 4 is what I call the blueprint. It's like how to take my work and put it into a psychiatric environment with that integral mindset. I go into fair detail about what people experience now and how it could be different. That doesn't mean that it's the final blueprint, but I think that chapter could be a starting point for people who have some curiosity and are interested in bringing new ideas forward. And in the end, I couldn't do objective scientific work. It was detective work, just trying to figure things out along the way. Maybe somebody will do more objective scientific work in the future, but I do give client feedback. And I talk about one guy, Dr. Ricardo Oki, who actually represents a subgroup of people who really were able to stop their medications and recover completely just from watching my videos. Just having that orientation was enough for many people to stop medications for good, So that was great. And then I talk about some other client stories there as well. And that's from their words. That's not me. That's them talking. Okay. I have a gratitude section that I think I do want to spend a few minutes on. And then I've got a screener questionnaire, what I ask clients for a retreat to do. The client agreement is there, and then a description of the client in a 30 or of the retreat in a 30-page handbook. I just want to say on this call, and if any of you guys are out there, my gratitude section is 4 pages, and that's because I have had a lot of help along the way, and I've had a lot of people who have given me wisdom and inspiration, experience, giving me their experience, and starting with my wife, Lisa Spandori, then my clients, Monica Kettler and Kirsten, Tim Canote, etc. Stan Groff and Ken Wilber, Dr. David Lukoff was a big help. Then all the people at Groff Transpersonal Training who helped me with my training, starting with the late Tav Sparks, my trainers in Brazil, Alvaro Jardine, Dora Jardine, my friends Antonio Pedro and Carolyn Green in Canada. It keeps going. Then I get into the transpersonal psychiatrists, Tim Reed, Jules Evans. I was in their book. The pioneers like Mosher and John Weir Perry. Manjari Das helped me a lot in editing the book. And Sylvie Bailey, I can't pronounce her French name. She was the one who did my graphics, which I'm very happy with. A number of courageous psychiatrists out there, including Calvin, he's in here, and Russell Razak, you probably know him. So there's many people I thank here. I don't know all of these psychiatrists, but I've been very influenced by their work. And I give an entire paragraph to Petros Livonis, who is the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He did a conference last year on psychosis and spirituality. And I think for the president of the APA to do that at Rutgers University, I think that takes a lot of guts. There's a lot of leaders out there championing spiritually transformative experiences, even if they're not spiritual emergencies, but people like Catherine Lucas, Emma Bragdon, Isabel Clarke, Janet Werner doing her movie, Gino Yu in Hong Kong, Yvonne Kaysen, she's the founder of the Spiritual Awakenings International, Katie Mottram from Emerging Proud, the transpersonal psychologists who have been very influential for me, ex-president of Eurotas, the European Association of Transpersonal Psychology, Bernadette Blin, and many other transpersonal psychologists have talked to me over the years, really donating their time. Nobody ever charged me for their time. Our transpersonal community in Brazil, and then podcasters, guys like Will Hall on Madness Radio, Mike Williams at Psyche Truth, creators, filmmakers, Phil Borges, who made Crazy Wise, and others. The Crazy Wise conference crew, I learned so much at those conferences just from meeting people live. And the greater peer community, Oryx Cohn, Josh Roberts, Monica Cassani at Beyond Meds, Robin Timmers from the Hearing Voices Network, Sasha DeBrule, Stephen Morgan. I mean, tons of people have given me their time and experience and wisdom and forced me to really think things through, Paris Williams with his book, Rethinking Madness, and Robert Whitaker from maddenamerica.com. I mean, he really put the screws to criticizing what was wrong with psychiatry. It was very helpful. And then closing with my shamanic friends in Brazil, my family, my friends, my therapists, and my deceased cat, who, don't get me started on that, but was a magical client and a great teacher of stillness. So Zen, if you're out there, this is for you. Okay, buddy? So I guess I'll stop the sharing at this point.
So Sean,
Yeah.
there are no questions in the chat, so you could just open it up and invite questions.
Okay.
Well, there is a comment. This work is really ahead of our time, but the world will catch up.
I hope so. David Lukoff, he's been working on this for 30 years, 40 years, and incredible. Hey, Tony, good to see you.
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, I
Tony was a
wanted to
client of mine
ask,
last year.
do you have mentioned plans for future work or where you want to take this? Because I didn't see one of the chapters being on what's going to happen next.
Well, the future work, I think it's not entirely clear to me, but I do want to get into some kind of a training situation where I'm training other people to do what I do. And at the end of the book, like I said in part 4, there's this blueprint where maybe we can take it into an institutional situation, where I can sort of create a structure within an institution to do the work. Something like that is where I want to go. Okay, Zachary is asking, I want to ask if Sean has anything to help depressive episodes from bipolar disorder. A lot of this work helps manage hypomanic episodes, but depression seems very different. Actually, from my perspective, I haven't worked with a lot of people with depression, but the holotropic breathwork trainers have. And provided that people have the energy to actually do that work, it can be done. Basically, it's just the other side of the coin of a manic episode. And to heal depression, the same idea is, using breathwork, using holotropic breathwork principles like I do. So if somebody calls me and their main issue is depression, I'd say, okay, do you want to do a retreat? Unfortunately, when I was developing my work, I wanted to focus on the spiritual side of psychosis, because that's where you can really see the spiritual connection to this so-called mental disorder. And it's very difficult to see the spiritual dimension of just feeling miserable and not wanting to bathe yourself and not wanting to leave your bed and this kind of thing. Like, what's so spiritual about that, right? There's no direct, tangible experience. So I steered away from that. But it can be handled with the same retreat approach. Zachary's saying again, I wonder if I might want to create a community for people like this. The best place I know is Shades of Awakening. That's a Facebook group online. It's a little slower than it used to be, but it's got 4,000 members. It's on Facebook, Shades of Awakening. The Hearing Voices Network is a huge network, and that's about, and they've exploded all over Brazil as well. But hearing voices tends to get labeled as schizophrenia or schizoaffective, perhaps. And they seem to be making good progress. It's not necessarily about healing. It's about giving a reinterpretation of what a hallucination is, and how to relate to it. And that can lead to healing. If you can relate to your visions and voices in a different way, then yeah, you can get there. Could you remind us what mania is a spiritual expression of? Oh, well, I would just say that when people, I think it's very tangible, it's not too intellectual. People think that they're Jesus, that they're dead, that they're dying, they're being reborn, they're in a battle between good and evil. They feel like they're on a spiritual mission here to save the world. Um, they just tend to have delusions that are of a deeply spiritual nature. And what I'm saying is that it's a delusion and it can get you in trouble and you could get hospitalized, but it has significant meaning because you're in touch with the inherent spiritual dimension of yourself. And that's where the disorder is coming from, And that's why people tend to have the same 13 spiritual symptoms over and over again. John Weir Perry listed a list of, here's what people experience. Boom, 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 boom. When I put up a video about that, people just lost it. They were like, oh my God, everything you said is what happened to me. And the psychiatrist had told people that their minds were chaos, that their minds were mush. And as soon as people saw that their delusions were the same as the delusions that everybody else was going through, then there's a hidden logic there, that people are not crazy, that there's some deeper thing unfolding. And R.D. Laing would call it an intended reorganization of the psyche that's getting blocked. Oh, and now, and from the book, you'll see that I talk about it as a Kundalini process more than anything else. Like, I just feel like it's, we're working with Kundalini energy, and the sooner we see that, the better. You mentioned it took some time to recover. If it's spiritual awakening, does that mean everybody has to wait that long to understand the process and go in remission? Is there a way to heal faster or let time be the healer? I think that if you've had multiple episodes, like 3 or more, it's highly unlikely that time is going to be your healer. It tends to get like a broken record. People don't heal. They get stuck in the same themes. We don't know why. And that's why I created the retreat, because on the retreat, then people can use this process for voluntarily going into your non-ordinary state experiences using the breath. And then you can work out things in a safe way. And you can do this while you're medicated. You don't need to fight psychiatry or anything like that. Whatever meds you're on, you just stay on your meds and you go into this deeper process to work on healing the trauma that's behind the disorder. Intended reorganization of the psyche, that's what we're trying to do. But we've always treated it from a medical side, like this is a brain injury, and the longer you let it go, the more dangerous it is for your brain, even though the exams don't show that kind of problem happening, So I don't have any worry about psychosis. Do you work with rumination? How do you do it? Can you minimize it or make it disappear? Yeah. Well, if you're talking about rumination, like having the same thought going over and over and over in your brain, to me, that's not a sign of mental illness. That's just something normal people go through all the time. And at least when I ruminate myself, when I'm stuck in a process of, wow, how am I going to deal with this person? Or, oh, if they say this to me, I'm going to say that to them. And then, you get into these kind of fantasy arguments, trying to resolve dilemmas and things like that. Recognize the emotion you have and observe it and give it space to express and recognize that it's a part of yourself. That can end ruminations. That's the technique I teach at the end of my book, Conscious Emotional Clearing, is about working through the emotion that you're feeling that is getting triggered by whatever you're involved in. All right. So I don't know if some people have even, like, can you resolve even deeper ruminations? Well, I imagine that they're just trauma related like everything else. But what if the person has not experienced any trauma? Is it trauma from past lives? The thing about trauma is that we don't remember trauma. It's the aspect of the trauma that we're holding is blocked. You might remember part of it. So for example, with sex abuse, I can meet people, and I've worked with people that have vague recollections of things that have gone on, but it's not clear to them what exactly happened. And then after the work, boom, it all starts to come to the surface. And then, oh my God, like, and it's really graphic and painful. And so there you have an example. If somebody knows they're traumatized, they don't know the details. And then when those feelings come up, it's like it's happening to them again. So what I would suggest is before you start to go off onto past lives, and I can't dismiss past lives, but before you start to think, well, what's going on with you is past lives, I want to see a world where we work the trauma first. Maybe past life come up in your trauma, you know. And if that's the case, cool. You just work through it like anything else.
John, the other thing that you and I have talked about, trauma doesn't have to be anything horrible. I've known someone that was traumatized at the age of 4 when the father angrily yelled, cursed, and tore up a coloring book.
Sure,
That
sure.
set their personality to having defenses. And so it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be horrible traumas that affect us.
Right. And Calvin, for people who don't know you, Calvin is a addiction psychiatrist, spent many years at Rutgers University. And, you know, he was trained in the 1970s before medicating everybody became the main thing, right? Yeah. So he's got a lot of experience with this. And I describe trauma as the part of an experience that you do not allow yourself to feel, whatever that is, you know, and it could be, yeah, a teacher sternly correcting you in front of the class when you're, you know, 8 years old. But it could also be a car accident, or in my case, it was a scuba diving accident that triggered my episode, you know, and I literally could not allow myself to feel fear, because if I started to feel afraid 30 meters below the surface, I could have died. I really could have died. So I had to relax. I could not let the fear come up. And it went back into my unconscious, and it surfaced at a self-help seminar, you know, months later. I didn't know I was traumatized at the time. I thought I was fine. You'll see videos on YouTube that have this, where like a deer or some kind of animal is chased by a predator, like a tiger, something like that. And then they get away. They get away. And what you see is the animal, after it rests a little bit, it'll start to shake. It'll start to shiver like this. And it shows the somatic aspect of what the animal has gone through. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about releasing trauma, like getting into the human body. There's a best-selling book from a psychiatrist, Van der Kolk, The
Yeah.
Body Keeps Score. And he's the first psychiatrist to really come out and say, look, we're holding trauma in the body and we've got to release it this way, you know. But they're just scratching the surface. I think in his work, he's just scratching the surface. What we're doing goes deeper. Yeah. Zachary wrote, some people think that we just have brains that are wired differently. I don't think trauma is necessary for a person to be bipolar. Everybody has some degree of trauma. I addressed this issue of the idea of neurodiversity right in the front of the book. Not that I'm against the idea, I'm not. I think that some people are more sensitive than others. You've got that there. But if you just sort of say to yourself, well, I'm not traumatized, I'm not neurodiverse, then that framework gives you a negation of a potential chance to heal, you know? And from what I've seen so far, the vast majority of people don't want to heal. They're not interested. It doesn't drive them. Honestly, I think people are just defensive about the idea. It's like, well, I've got a problem. I don't have a problem. I'm just fine. I don't have any, there's nothing wrong with me, you know? And for the record, I work on my issues as best I can. And I've even in a few situations, I put myself in my own retreat. I called some holotropic breathwork facilitators that I've hired to work with clients of mine. And I said, look, I'm going through something that's I think it's leading to a birth process. Can you put me up for 5 days? And sure enough, they did. And we worked through my birth material, you know, which for some reason had not come up for 9 years of doing holotropic breath work. But then in that moment, this particular issue surfaced, you know, and that kind of thing. Let's see. Thanks. Is dopamine or serotonin theory incorrect? Yes, completely incorrect. It's a myth. promoted by psychiatry. And you can read about the details of that myth through the books of Robert Whitaker. The research shows that people with bipolar disorder and other mental disorders have a dopamine and serotonin range that are exactly the same as normal people. I hope, Calvin, I hope I don't step on your toes when I say that, but it's really come out in a visible way. And Robert Whitaker was really the one who tracked all of that down and said, look, there's no research for this. I've had psychiatrists tell me point blank, they don't have anything on a biological level that like a test. There's nothing.
Though, Sean, I think what I liked about your book is that you do recognize that there are some bipolar disorders. There are some people with schizophrenia that truly looks like it's a biogenetic disorder. My experience in the field, I think in answer to Zachary's question, it isn't so much the theories that are in error, it's the practice. And it has to do with the individual. You've met individuals that had different aspects of bipolar and schizophrenia. So I would say rather than looking and challenging a theory, look at the individual case.
In my case, I'm still waiting to see the evidence for the biology. I haven't seen it.
My evidence is clinically.
Yeah, through clinical
And
observation, right?
and what I told you, Sean, I'm gonna write a review of your book for the American Psychiatric Association. And one of the things that I think needs to be said, any research in the future on bipolar disorder has to include not just PTSD diagnoses, but trauma assessments, because nothing includes the range of what you're talking about.
Well,
So,
that's
so
great to
many of the
hear.
studies with bipolar are very biased.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I would say in my book, what is there is the acknowledgement that there will be a subset of people that possibly due to the limitations that we're working with, but there's probably always going to be people who are going to be better off on psychiatric medications and who might find this deeper work impossible to do. And to give you an example, one group of people that I would suggest are not suited to my work and would be better off on psychiatric medication are people who do not acknowledge that they have a disorder of any kind. You know, if they've been in and out of the hospital 5 times, they just blame their parents. They say, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm perfectly fine. It's my parents that keep putting me in the hospital. If you have someone at that level of denial, you can't work with them. You know, there has to be a certain amount of honesty there. And so when I do a questionnaire for people, what I'm looking for are, can I understand this person's story? Are they giving me their biography here that makes sense to why their mania happened? Because if I don't understand what's coming through, chances are they're not being honest with themselves. And we all lie to ourselves a little bit, but they're not being honest with themselves. It would be a bad investment for them and potentially dangerous for them and for me. You know, it can go that way. Someone asked here, what do you think of EMDR or similar trauma therapies? Haven't had a lot of experience with EMDR, but I know that it is energetically based, from what I understand. It's about, feeling the energy of what's going on. It's got kind of a stronger spiritual dimension than people like to say, but it's pretty mild compared to what we're doing. Somebody brought it up at one conference, and somebody had insulted my work and said that doing holotropic breath work with people, and again, I modify it, but he said that's like using a chainsaw on the psyche. And I said, well, it might be a chainsaw, but EMDR is like using dental floss on the psyche. I mean, how far are you going to get with that, And it is true. I mean, the work we do can be really powerful. It can be really powerful. Oh, how can we order your book? It's on Amazon. The easiest way, I think, is just to go to my website, bipolarawakenings.com, and you can just click on that big image of my book there.
I'd certainly like to thank you, Sean. That was a great review, and good luck with it.
And Calvin, thank you very much for your support. It's been the culmination of 17 years of work. And ironically, it kind of feels like a strange milestone because on the one hand, it could open up a lot of things for me personally, like in terms of where the work goes. It could open up the work and all that stuff. On the other hand, if it doesn't, and it just needs to percolate for like 5 years, I'm good. I've done my part. I can go, I don't know, go do something else for a while. It's okay. It does feel like I really accomplished something. I met a client of mine in Bali when I was in Bali a few months ago. I was talking about the book, and he said to me, he said, "You've done your part." And I said, "Tim, that was the last line of the book. I've done my part, you know?" And to feel that inside is very empowering. You know, it's a big relief to feel like, okay, I've done what was asked of me. And I feel like it was asked of me by God in a sense, you know, this healing agent. So yeah, I'm happy it's done. I'm really pleased with the book. I made, after I sent the final product to the people who were preparing for editing on Amazon, after that, and they sent me the final PDF, I made 650 more corrections. So after my final proof, I gave 650 more corrections. So it should be in good shape. I hope you all enjoy it. If there's parts of the book that are a little bit, I don't know, turn you off, just skip it and keep going. You know, you can take it chunks at a time. That's it. Let's see. Got a few other things here. Congrats. Thanks for your work. Thanks, bunches. I've been following you for 20 years, Nadia. Yeah, I see you there, Nadia. A longtime follower. So nice to see you here. And nice to see Tony here too when he was here. Okay, so that's it. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay,
Ciao.
bye-bye.